Tom Fogerty left Creedence Clearwater Revival when the band was still near its peak, a decision that, for many years, left many people asking, why would someone standing in the storm of success choose to walk away, almost empty-handed? He was not the lead singer. He was not the first face people mentioned. The Fogerty name onstage was often overshadowed by the spotlight surrounding his younger brother, John. But before the world came to know Creedence as a hit-making machine of American rock, Tom was there, the older brother, the steady rhythm guitarist, a part of the sonic foundation that helped songs like Proud Mary, Bad Moon Rising, and Fortunate Son become defining marks of an entire era. The tragedy of Tom Fogerty lies in the fact that he was both very close to legend and pushed to the edge of that very legend. He had talent, ambition, and a hunger to be recognized, but the deeper the band moved into success, the smaller he felt within the very group that carried his own family name. Leaving in search of his own voice, Tom stepped into a difficult solo journey, where old fame was not enough to save him from loneliness, disappointment, and family fractures that would never fully heal. Then death came too soon, painful and quiet, closing the life of an artist who had once stood beside one of the greatest bands in America, yet in the end still seemed to be asking, did anyone truly hear my guitar? Tom Fogerty was born on November 9, 1941, in Berkeley, California, but much of his childhood was tied to El Cerrito, an eastern suburb of the San Francisco Bay Area, during the years when post-war America was expanding rapidly. His father, Galen Fogerty, worked for Pacific Gas and Electric, while his mother, Edith Fogerty, took care of the family and raised the children within the familiar rhythm of California's working class at the time. By day, there were school, work, and new suburbs constantly rising around the Bay Area. By night, there was the sound of radio drifting from living rooms, garages, or small roadside diners. Rock and roll was beginning to spread very quickly across America. Tom was drawn into that music from a very early age. He listened to Elvis Presley, Little Richard, rhythm and blues, and the rockabilly records playing across California radio stations. While John Fogerty was still rather quiet as a child, Tom was more accustomed to standing in front of a crowd. He began singing and playing guitar as a teenager, appearing at school dances and on small stages around the Bay Area. In those early years, Tom was the one who more clearly had the presence of a lead singer among the friends around him. He was used to holding the microphone, talking to the audience, and carrying the band from one show to the next. In the late 1950s, Tom joined the Playboy Boys and then Spiderweb and the Insects. Those bands existed within the very distinctive world of California garage rock at the time, where young groups played in small bars, school halls, or local weekend events. In 1959, Spiderweb and the Insects signed a contract with Delphi Records. The group recorded the song Lita Jane and entered a professional studio while Tom was still very young. Everything ended fairly quickly after that. The band broke up before it could truly establish a place for itself, and the song did not leave much of a mark on the market. But from those years, Tom had already begun to pass through all the things that belonged to the life of a professional musician. Studios, record labels, contracts, and the feeling that a band could disappear with startling speed. After Spiderweb and the Insects ended, Tom continued by forming the Blue Velvets, then Tommy Fogerty and the Blue Velvets. This was the period when John Fogerty, Stu Cook, and Doug Clifford gradually became fully present in the lineup. Tom still stood at the front of the stage, singing lead and guiding most of the shows around California. John, at that time, played more guitar and spent time paying attention to song structure, arrangements, and studio sound. The band's early years passed through small stages, short trips around the Bay Area, and constant name changes as they tried to find a more stable direction. None of them knew then that the very band playing around those small California stages would one day become Creedence Clearwater Revival. Tom and his earliest bands existed at exactly the moment when California was beginning to be covered by the garage rock wave of the early 1960s. Around Berkeley, El Cerrito, and the entire East Bay, almost every weekend there were dance halls or small stages. hiring local bands to play rock and roll for suburban teenagers. Groups like the Blue Velvets lived within a very different rhythm from the image of rock stars that would come later. By day, many of them still worked or went to school as usual. By night, they loaded amplifiers and guitars into cars and drove between shows around the Bay Area. California radio at the time constantly played Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, rhythm and blues, and surf rock, causing hundreds of garage rock bands to spring up at the same time across the San Francisco Bay Area. Tom was often the one who called venues, scheduled rehearsals, and then drove with the group between small stages around the Bay Area on weekends. While many garage rock bands around California vanished after only a few months, his group kept moving through dance halls, local bars, and smoky stages around the East Bay. In the early 1960s, Tom Fogerty's band still existed around small stages in California under the name the Blue Velvets. They played in bars, at local dances, and continued, trying to keep themselves alive among hundreds of garage rock bands that were appearing across America in the post-Elvis Presley era. But by 1964, everything began to change when the group signed a contract with Fantasy Records. At that time, Fantasy began bringing the band into the more professional machinery of the music industry. The label wanted the group to change its image and rename itself the Golliwogs, a name that, later on, none of the members truly liked. But at that moment, they still accepted it in order to have the chance to keep recording. During the years under the name the Golliwogs, the band released quite a few singles, but failed to create a major impact. Their songs repeatedly failed on the market, while the group remained stuck on local stages around California, instead of breaking into the center of the American music market at the time. It was during that period that John's voice began appearing more frequently on the new recordings. He wrote more songs and paid close attention to song structure, arrangements, and studio sound. While Tom still held on more to the spirit of classic stage rock and roll, most of the musical decisions at that time began to pass through John, more than in previous years. That change happened slowly, but clearly enough for everyone in the band to see it. Tom shifted more toward rhythm guitar, and backing vocals, while John gradually became the central voice on the new recordings. Doug Clifford, many years later, called Tom the ultimate team player, because he accepted that change without breaking the band apart. During the years when the Golliwogs were still struggling to find their place, Tom stepped back, so the group could continue moving forward. By 1968, after many years existing under the name the Golliwogs without making any major mark, the band decided to change its name once again. None of them knew at the time that this new name would soon appear all over American radio in the late 1960s. But from that moment, the band's sound had already begun to differ sharply from most of the rock groups emerging around California. While psychedelic rock and increasingly complex recordings were filling San Francisco, the group moved in almost the opposite direction. Their music carried the colors of swamp rock, roots rock, and the atmosphere of the American South. Even though all four members had grown up in California, their debut album, under the new name, was released in 1968. The cover of Susie Q quickly became the group's first hit and carried the name CCR beyond California's local music scene. The song was played continuously on American radio, helping the band appear before a national audience for the first time, instead of remaining only around the Bay Area as in the years before. After nearly a decade of playing in small bars, constantly changing the band's name and releasing failed singles, they finally stepped into the American rock market at exactly the moment when rock was changing very quickly. Along with that success, the positions inside the band also changed completely. John was now not only writing most of the songs, but also shaping much of the group's sound. His voice became the center of the new recordings, while Tom moved fully into rhythm guitar and backing vocals. On stage, audiences began to see John as the central face of the band. Meanwhile, Tom continued, standing beside the group he had once pulled through the first local stages around the Bay Area. In 1969, the group that had once only lingered around California's local music life became a name covering America in just a few short months. While many rock bands of the same era took years to build their position, CCR exploded continuously at a rare speed. In that year alone, the band released 3 albums: Bayou Country, Green River, and Willie and the Poor Boys. Songs such as Proud Mary, Bad Moon Rising, Green River, Fortunate Son, and Down on the Corner became major Billboard hits one after another. Those songs appeared constantly on American radio throughout that year. There was a period when their record sales in the American market even surpassed the Beatles. That sound traveled through long-haul trucks, bars in the American South, and major radio stations in New York and Los Angeles. The band entered a relentless touring cycle, with concerts in arenas, a constantly moving schedule, and television programs broadcast nationwide. Unlike the psychedelic rock wave that was dominating San Francisco in the late 1960s, the band brought a sound that was concise, rough, and deeply American. Those songs appeared more on the radios of long-haul trucks, in southern bars, and in working-class town than in the psychedelic world that was covering San Francisco in the late 1960s. But right in the middle of that greatest period of success, the internal structure of the band also changed completely. John was now controlling most of the songwriting, arranging, and studio direction. He almost entirely decided which direction the band's sound would take, which songs would be recorded, and how the instruments had to appear in the final mix. Meanwhile, Tom retreated deeper into the role of rhythm guitar and backing vocals. In the years before, he had still been the one leading the band through small stages in California, but audiences now saw only John in the central position, on stage. By 1970, the band had become one of the biggest bands in America. Cosmo's Factory pushed them even higher with songs such as Who'll Stop the Rain, Looking Out My Back Door, Travelin' Band, and Up Around the Bend. The album achieved multi-platinum sales and turned CCR into a true giant touring machine. The band moved constantly from city to city, appeared heavily on television, and played in arenas packed with audiences. In the post-Woodstock period, when American rock was becoming increasingly tied to enormous stages and hippie culture, the band carried a completely different image. They evoked the feeling of the American working class, more than that of psychedelic stars from San Francisco. Plaid shirts, guitars, radio waves, and songs about long roads or wartime America during the Vietnam War made CCR a band that truck drivers, workers, and mainstream audiences could all feel close to. But it was also during that greatest period of success that arguments inside the band began appearing more frequently. John was still controlling most of the songwriting, arranging, and studio direction at the time. The members gradually felt that they no longer had a real voice inside the group. Before Pendulum was recorded, the entire band held a tense meeting about their future. Many years later, John recalled that the others wanted a more democratic model, where everyone could write songs and sing. That meeting took place right before Pendulum was recorded. After many years in which John had almost single-handedly decided the group's musical direction, the arguments were now beginning to appear more openly inside the studio. While John increasingly held the absolute central position, the songs Tom wrote continued to be left out of the group's new albums. He still appeared on stage every night before tens of thousands of people, but inside the studio, the distance between him and the rest of CCR grew larger and larger. The songs Tom wrote kept piling up without being included on the band's albums. After Pendulum was released in late 1970, Tom decided to leave the band to begin his own career. Many years later, Tom remembered that period with one short sentence: "I had all these songs bottled up inside me, but nowhere to put them." Tom's departure from the band happened at the very moment when those songs were still appearing heavily on American radio. The tours were still running through packed arenas, and Pendulum had only recently been released. But inside the studio, the disputes over musical control, songsings, and the role of each member could no longer be kept hidden as they had been in previous years. After leaving the band, Tom Fogerty entered his own career at exactly the time when the old songs were still covering American radio airwaves. In 1972, he released the album Tom Fogerty, then followed it with Excalibur in the same year. Unlike the increasingly tight and heavily controlled sound of CCR under John Fogerty, Tom's solo recordings carried warm colors of Americana, country rock, and roots rock. Tom's own recordings remained tied to guitars, small studios, and the road bands of the American West, more than to the stadium sound that was filling radio in the early 1970s. Even so, most audiences still saw him as part of the old band, rather than as an artist starting over from the beginning. The public continued to see him as the former CCR member, instead of as a truly independent artist. His first albums did not achieve major commercial success, did not appear heavily on radio the way Creedence Clearwater Revival had, and did not bring Tom back to the center of American rock in the early 1970s. While John was still seen as the person who had shaped most of the band's sound, Tom had to start again from the beginning, in a market that was changing very quickly after the Woodstock era. In 1974, Tom released Zephyr National and then Myopia. It was during this period that one of the strangest moments in CCR history appeared. The song Mystic Isle Avalon on Zephyr National became the last time all four members of Creedence Clearwater Revival appeared together on a studio recording, but it was not a true reunion. John recorded his parts separately, instead of working directly with the rest of the band. Because of that, the atmosphere of the old band never truly returned inside that studio. During the early years of his solo career, Tom continued to record and tour, but most audiences who saw him still remembered Creedence Clearwater Revival more than his new albums. While the American rock market had shifted toward arena rock and MTV, Tom continued to appear around the familiar small studios and stages of California. By the late 1970s, American rock had begun moving into a completely different scale from the era of Creedence Clearwater Revival. Arena rock and MTV gradually turned stage image into a mandatory part of the music market. Musicians who had grown out of California's local stages in the early 1960s, like Tom, began to be pushed farther away from the center of the industry. The arenas that had once been packed with audiences in the late 1960s were now replaced by smaller stages and local venues around California. While MTV began turning American rock into a world of music videos and large-scale stage imagery, Tom kept moving between studios, long roads, and familiar small shows around the Bay Area. Those songs had once belonged to the age of AM radio and long-distance drives. By the late 1970s, America had begun listening to rock in a different way, but the farther he moved away from CCR, the more the public remembered the old band, rather than his new projects. For most American audiences, Tom was still the man who once stood in Creedence Clearwater Revival, more than an artist entering a new chapter of his career. While John Fogerty continued to be seen as the creative center of the CCR sound, Tom gradually drifted away from the center of the American rock market in the late 1970s. Entering the 1980s, Tom Fogerty continued making music, even though his place in American rock was now very different from the days of Creedence Clearwater Revival. In 1980, the four members of the band appeared together in a short performance at Tom's wedding. It was one of the rare times the group stood on the same stage after breaking up. But that brief reunion did not lead to any real reconciliation. The years-long conflicts between John Fogerty and the rest of CCR continued to exist behind the stage. In 1981, Tom released Deal It Out, the final solo album released while he was still alive. The album came out under Fantasy Records, with songs such as Champagne Plove, Mystery Train, and Deal It Out. Tom's music at this point still followed the familiar direction of roots rock and country rock, rather than chasing the arena rock or hard rock that was filling the American market in the early 1980s. He continued making music in a way that stayed closer to bars, long roads, and the Americana quality that had appeared since the earliest CCR years, rather than the stadium sound dominating radio at the time. By 1984, Tom continued collaborating with Randy Oda on the album Precious Gems. These projects kept him tied to the music life around the Bay Area, but the scale had become much smaller than in the days when Creedence Clearwater Revival was at its peak. While MTV changed the way American rock operated through image, music videos, increasing stages. Tom still existed in an older musical space, connected more to guitars, studios, and small shows than to the star culture of the 1980s. During those years, the music life around the Bay Area was very different from the time when Creedence Clearwater Revival had been at its height. San Francisco and Berkeley were still full of small stages, local bars, and studios operating throughout the week, but most of the spotlight of American rock had now shifted to Los Angeles, New York, and the rapidly expanding world of MTV in the early 1980s. Many musicians from the old California garage rock generation continued to exist in a less illuminated musical rhythm, playing on weekends, recording for small projects, and moving between local stages without much media attention anymore. Tom also lived in that rhythm during the final years of his career. He continued appearing around fantasy studios in Berkeley, meeting old Bay Area musicians, and maintaining the habit of making music steadily, even after the American rock market had completely changed. Recording sessions often took place far more quietly than in the days when CCR was moving between arenas across America. There were no longer touring schedules covered heavily by television or major press conferences. Most of the time, it was just the studio, guitars, short drives around California, and small stages where audiences still remembered the AM radio era of the late 1960s. To many local artists around the Bay Area at the time, Tom no longer carried the image of a major rock star. He seemed more like a guitarist from the older generation of local stages. Someone who still showed up on time at the studio, talked with sound engineers, played through the whole show, then got back in the car and drove to another city on the weekend. The most famous part of his life now belonged to another era, but the rhythm of California musicianship that Tom had entered in the late 1950s never completely disappeared. In 1986, Tom appeared in an interview with MTV and spoke about John Fogerty in a way that surprised many people. He acknowledged his younger brother's talent and said John's voice was so unique that it could stand beside Ray Charles or Van Morrison. But at the same time, he also admitted that he could not listen to Centerfield without thinking of CCR. For many people, that was one of the rare times Tom publicly spoke about the fact that he had never truly separated from the band that had been with him since the days of the Blue Velvets. In 1988, Tom entered his final recording sessions with the album Sidekicks at Fantasy Studios in Berkeley. His son, Jeff Fogerty, played bass during these recording sessions. The album was later released in 1992, 2 years after Tom's death. Sidekicks became the final recording tied to the man who had once stood at the front of the band. Years before those songs began filling American radio, Tom Fogerty married Gail Skinner when he was still very young, at around 18. At a time when his life still revolved around local bands, weekend shows, and the dream of breaking out of California's local music scene. That marriage took place many years before Creedence Clearwater Revival became one of the biggest bands in America. Tom and Gail later had 4 children, while his life was being pulled deeper and deeper into touring schedules and the music industry. When CCR exploded in the late 1960s, Tom's family also had to exist alongside the non-stop rhythm of the band. Long tours, constant recording sessions, and CCR's heavy presence on American radio caused the private lives of the members to change very quickly in just a few short years. Unlike many rock stars of the same era, Tom was hardly associated with public scandals or an image of self-destruction in the media. But the pressure inside CCR and the conflicts that lasted for years began to directly affect the rest of his life. After Creedence Clearwater Revival broke up, Tom's first marriage also ended. There was no major scandal or Hollywood-style legal battle, but the post-CCR years left behind a lingering sense of collapse across many parts of his life. The greatest success of his career also became the very thing that completely changed everything behind the stage. In 1980, Tom married Tricia Clapper. She was the woman who'd stayed with him during the final part of his life and witnessed all the years in which the relationship between Tom and John Fogerty grew increasingly worse. For many years after the band broke up, the battle between the former members was no longer only about music. Saul Zaentz, the head of Fantasy Records, became the center of that conflict. While John saw Fantasy Records as the place that had controlled and held the rights to CCR's music, Tom, along with Stu Cook and Doug Clifford, continued to stand closer to the label. Disputes over voting rights, royalties, contracts, and lawsuits pushed the relationship between the two brothers farther and farther apart. Many years later, John called his brother's condition Patty Hearst syndrome, referring to the fact that Tom had sided with the person John saw as the greatest opponent of his life. Meanwhile, Tom once said, "Saul is my best friend." Angry letters, lawsuits, and prolonged arguments pushed the conflict between the two brothers far beyond the scope of an ordinary broken-up band. For many people around CCR, it was no longer just a conflict over creativity or musical power, but the long collapse of an entire family. By the late 1980s, Tom's health began to decline seriously after back surgery. During a blood transfusion, he contracted HIV, at a time when the blood screening system in the United States still had many gaps. Tom later developed complications related to AIDS and contracted tuberculosis because of his weakened immune system. America at that time was entering the early years of the AIDS crisis, when fear, silence, and stigma spread across the media as well as everyday life. Many families kept their loved ones' illnesses private because of public pressure, while AIDS was often viewed with panic more than understanding throughout the 1980s. By the late 1980s, the Bay Area had also become one of the places where America felt the spreading AIDS crisis most clearly. Hospitals, clinics, and even the music life around San Francisco gradually changed because of fear, silence, and the growing number of empty spaces appearing in the artistic community. Many families kept their loved ones' conditions hidden, while the American media at the time often looked at AIDS with panic rather than understanding. In that atmosphere, many people from the late 1960s rock generation began growing older in an America that was completely different from the one in which they had once appeared on the radio. While classic rock stations continued playing Proud Mary, Bad Moon Rising, and Green River every day, most of Tom's final years passed between hospitals, studios, and the closest people around him in Arizona and the Bay Area. The giant stages, the tours across America, and the AM radio era of the late 1960s now belonged to a very distant world. Tom Fogerty died on September 6, 1990, in Scottsdale, Arizona, when he was only 48 years old. At the funeral, John Fogerty delivered the eulogy for his brother and said a sentence that would later be repeated many times whenever people spoke about the relationship between the two brothers. "We didn't necessarily grow up." John only stood and read a few short lines at the funeral. After many years of lawsuits, anger, and silence, most of what remained between the two brothers was never spoken aloud anymore. After the funeral, everything between the two brothers finally stayed behind those years of lawsuits, late-night radio, and oldest songs continuing to run across America. Many years after Tom Fogerty's death, those songs continued to appear on nighttime radio, in roadside bars, and on long drives across America. But behind that familiar sound, there were not only giant stages or the AM radio era of the late 1960s. Somewhere there was still the image of small stages around Berkeley, amplifiers loaded into cars on weekends, and a man who had once kept the band alive long enough to reach the era when the rest of America finally knew their name. Tom's final years still passed among places like those. Small studios around the Bay Area, long California roads late at night, and the life of a musician who kept playing music even when history had already begun moving in another direction.